Joining me now live to wrap up the week in Parliament is Liberal MP Andrew Laming and Labor MP Josh Burns. Good afternoon to you both. Thank you for joining me.
Afternoon, Danica.
No problems.
Let's get straight into it. Obviously, National Cabinet today, a number of issues canvassed, but in particular, National Cabinet has agreed to abandon the consensus model. Josh, we'll start with you. The border closure situation, I guess, has essentially fractured the National Cabinet. WA today refusing to sign up to a hotspot definition. But is the key point or the key takeaway that National Cabinet will progress with an agreement to disagree from now on?
Well, obviously, Scott Morrison doesn't have as much control as he likes to point out to people. I would make 2 points. The first of all is that we've said all along that state premiers need to be listening to the health advice that is given to them and the health advice that's provided and pertinent to their particular state. And that doesn't matter what political persuasion that premier is, whether you're Liberal premiers in New South Wales or South Australia or Tasmania, or Labor premiers in Queensland, Victoria or WA. We've been consistent on that, but I think it is really hardly surprising that Mark McGowan's chosen to go his own way and listen to his health experts and not Scott Morrison, because if you listen to Scott Morrison, then Clive Palmer would be running the border policy of WA, given the fact that Scott Morrison put the full force of the federal government behind Clive Palmer and his court case to bust open WA borders.
At what point, though, does this rhetoric have to stop? I mean, what reasons should the border still be in place in Western Australia by Christmas? Andrew, these, real people are being affected, families are being ripped apart. At what point does this rhetoric have to end?
Made a number of shots there, but effectively, Josh, you've got to remember that the health advice is being distorted by the premiers. They're not listening to their health experts. They're actually getting advice, not releasing it. And the premiers, well, their advice is just whatever suits them for their poll-driven purposes. I mean, common sense public health science went out the window. We've now left the solar system of reasonable science in this, and decisions around borders when you've got a population of 5 million people with 2 corona cases. It's pathetic to be locking a state down, but the view is that's how you win an election. There's no health expert saying to do that. And there's no one saying that the poor old town of Bungendie can't shop across the border town. They've lost their shopping centre on one side, so all the others have to drive 200 kilometres to a shop. We've got families torn apart because they can't visit their children. We've got a death last week, ostensibly waiting 16 hours for permission to evacuate a mum to a hospital over a border. This is not health advice. This is just losing control. And I think the PM has always been very strong about allowing premiers to make their own decisions. And the genius of National Cabinet is that, in fact, it's exposing the states for what they are, which is often intently self-interested, particularly the smaller states that aren't pitching in to help New South Wales and Victoria that really need it right now. We need a strong federation like we've never needed one since Henry Parkes, and we haven't got it at the moment.
It's been interesting as well, Josh, seeing what's happened in Queensland, but Anastasia Palaszczuk today saying that she's certainly open to discussions. WA now the only state that isn't. Do you think there's any political motivation behind that decision?
Well, I think the biggest thing motivating the premiers is keeping their state safe and keeping the transmission of the coronavirus low. And I think that the WA Premier, Mark McGowan, has done an excellent job of that. And I think the Queensland Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, has done an excellent job of that. And if the people of Queensland and WA believe that those premiers and their premiers are doing a good job keeping them safe, well then, there are worse things to be accused of. I think I would make the point to Andrews is that we, no one's arguing that we shouldn't have sensible discussions. I think the Prime Minister has announced that that the Federation and his National Cabinet has broken down today, and that doesn't help anyone.
Let's move on now to the situation in Queensland. We know this week that I guess lockdown has become somewhat of a luxury for around 400 AFL staff, executives and families. Andrew, let's start with you on the matter. We hear in the last couple of hours that there was a potential brawl with 2 AFL players. If you're somebody sitting at home watching this all unfold who can't get into Queensland for various reasons, you'd be pretty disappointed. Is there any hypocrisy on behalf of the Queensland government?
Well, try to be even-handed here, Danica. We know that major events are critically important. This one is still 7 weeks away and the COVID conditions could change, but Queensland's now over a barrel. Not only are we quarantining the 400 officials and players that came up this week, but we're going to ultimately have to let in the other VIPs with no quarantine for the game. We're hoping that we can do it, but we are now cornered and painted there by this decision. Yeah, I think Queenslanders do want a compassionate view for boarding house kids that just want to get home to see their parents and not be quarantined as teenagers. They want to know that people can come across for emergency reasons, family breakdown reasons, just a bit more compassion and some faster decision making. But again, it's the Prime Minister with the solution here. You red zone the parts that have COVID, and they can't cross the Queensland border or even the South Australian border, but you cannot just close down state against state, because otherwise they all wallow in the moral hazard of JobKeeper. But of course, all our hotels are empty, and we've got this ridiculous situation of only 500 people a week returning to each state. With 23,000 Australians locked overseas, the only country in the world where we do that. We've got 900,000 foreign students who'd like to start studying next year. They can be quarantined safely and brought here. Have we got the courage to do it in time, or we lose a $36 billion industry on top of all the other losses?
Josh, I'll ask you in regards to the AFL situation in Queensland. What do you make of it? As there has been a lot of criticism this week that people can't get into the state for various reasons, but here we have a 400-strong bubble allowed to enter the state.
Well, I think that, like with all things, the decisions of who comes in and out of the state is a matter for the Premier of Queensland, and she'll listen to the health experts and determining who can come in. I think that if the AFL is allowed to come in, then they should be treating that with respect. And I think that the story about the two players who are breaking the arrangements in Queensland is deeply disappointing. There are many Victorians who would like to get into Queensland right now, I'm sure, to see family or friends. And you know, it's up to all of us to make sure that we stay safe and respect the rules to help make sure the transmission of this virus stays low.
Let's move on now to the arrest of a pregnant woman in Victoria this week. We know that she was arrested in front of her partner and children for organising an anti-lockdown protest, charged with incitement. Andrew, do you think that this was a very heavy-handed approach?
Well, the rules of the land are that you can't incite congregation, and a state government, Labor or Liberal, brought this rule in, probably in response to the Black Lives Matter rallies, where many of the same people complaining about this arrest were vehemently against rallying at the time. So you've got to have a consistent position. There's no threat to freedom of speech. There's no need for a Freedom Day. That already exists in the Northern Territory, rightly so. I think you need to remember there is no time for congregating and protesting and rallying in stage 4 of COVID lockdowns. The state laws are clear. I'm not going to change my position because it's a Labor state government.
Josh, your thoughts on the arrest?
There's a couple of things to say, Danica. First of all, I think that everyone needs to take on the responsibility of doing the right thing and not congregating right now, as Andrew said. But I would like to take up a particular point, and that's raised by Mr. Craig Kelly, who has used this incident to compare Victoria with Nazi Germany. Now, Mr. Kelly has spent the last month giving false medical advice around hydroxychloroquine, and the Prime Minister has failed to rein in Craig Kelly. And now Craig Kelly, on 3 occasions, has compared the state of Victoria to Nazi Germany. Now, personally, it is deeply offensive. My family, I have had family who was killed in the gas chambers in Germany. The Prime Minister personally intervened in Mr. Kelly's pre-selection, and the Prime Minister should personally intervene. Craig Kelly should apologise, and there should be no comparisons to Nazi Germany by a federal government MP.
Andrew, do we have to be careful, you know, with that sort of rhetoric under these such circumstances?
I think all MPs are really careful, and some elect to make these comparisons and will wear the opprobrium accordingly. Look, there's no Dr. Craig Kelly here. No one's taking his medical advice. Anyone who is a patient of Dr. Craig Kelly should be worried, and that number is 0. So in the end, we need to move on and focus, because if we absolutely obsess over Craig Kelly, what you lose out with are really crazy border decisions. You end up with failed application of the science in this area, and we're already down $100 billion. That's now going to be $200 billion because we couldn't monitor a hotel quarantine corridor. They're the big issues. And at the moment, we've got 6 times the deaths we needed to have because we couldn't keep COVID quarantined. They're the big failures, and I'm not going to be diverted from following those and making sure they never happen again.
Just finally, I just want to ask you both about the economy. Australia has entered its first recession in almost 3 decades. Josh, June GDP numbers essentially revealing the nation's economy has slumped by 7%. Given the pandemic, was this recession always on the cards?
The economy was weak before the coronavirus. It was weak before the bushfires. There was already stagnant wage growth. There was low consumer confidence. The retail markets were really struggling. You only had to go to any retail high street in the country really to see that there was vacancies and the people and businesses were really struggling. This recession is deep, and it's going to be for even longer because of the decisions being made by the federal government. The decision to reduce the JobKeeper supplement is going to be hurt and felt really, really badly, especially in my home state of Victoria. Businesses have been contacting me and they are really, really concerned with the cuts of the Prime Minister. There also should be proper stimulus and a plan to create jobs. There is none, and we are going to be in this recession for a lot longer because of the decisions of Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg.
Andrew, your thoughts on this? We know that supplement will be cut. A number of business owners have relied on this over the last few months. Without the full payment, I mean, where does that leave our economy?
Look, viewers are going to be sick of me disagreeing with Josh on everything. I think most of what he said was sensible. I have always said that if there's specific locations, regions or even states that are clearly smashed by corona, I am open to that discussion that they need additional support. So I think it's a reasonable case for Josh to be making. In the end, it is about supporting a state that's been absolutely damaged by COVID like no other. And I would say the Prime Minister's decisions are going to make this a shorter recession than it will be in nearly every other country in the world, bar two. So I think we're in good company with New Zealand and Taiwan in our economic management. But I think it's a fair question for Josh to be saying in his own home state, can we provide more support to Victorians? Because clearly the level of lockdown is far longer and deeper than we could have anticipated. But let's keep in mind, this was also the actions of a Victorian Labor government that couldn't manage hotel quarantine. And that's what's cost us. These additional 500 lives doubled the length and doubled the duration and cost of COVID to the entire nation. So the question really is, how much blame does the Premier of Victoria carry?
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Andrew Lemming and Josh Burns, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks, Nika.
It's a pleasure.
Time now to check in on